Clearly up, as you guys mentioned, close to 5% earlier today. I think we pulled back a little bit off of those highs, given what our spot number is here at 63.2 with Bitcoin. But you're still down 4% on the month. You're still down 3% on the month when you look at ETH. Solana, as we talked about last time, has been an outperformer on a relative basis. It's done a little bit better, and you can see that when we look at the pairs in the lower right corner. But I think a lot of this is just that selling pressure that we talked about, whether it was, it's still to some extent with Mt. Gox. Obviously, the U.S. government holds a lot of crypto. It moves to exchanges. It can sell at various times. But Germany, the German government, was selling Bitcoin. We knew that. We knew it was a pretty sizable position. We've now seen those wallet addresses go to zero. So there's no more German Bitcoin left to sell. The Germans are no longer dumping on the market. And so that selling pressure has been removed. We've seen positive inflows on the ETF side. We can point to that in just a second. But I think this is just a little bit of a catch-up trade given just how much crypto got smacked down. We ran some numbers last time on the show, just talking about how, first of all, these sorts of moves, this type of volatility is not out of the ordinary. And then following these moves, same thing you see in anything else, right? You get to that point where I'll use the term oversold. You get smashed down enough, buyers show up, shorts have covered, and you get a big move to the upside. So I'm not surprised at all to see this sort of move. I think if you look at what is the market pricing in terms of implied vol, we've got a bigger expected moves now on a weekly basis, about $4,500 for Bitcoin, closer to $300 for Ethereum. Still well off of those highs that we've seen in terms of implied volatility. But your range on Bitcoin for the week, one standard deviation move takes you back up towards 68. From a technical perspective, that it seems like where you would trade in terms of resistance. What happens when you get there? If you get there, we'll see. But 58 to the downside now, that low has moved up in terms of what the market is pricing in. And then you've got 3,000 on the downside for ETH on a 1 week, one standard deviation move, 3,600 on the upside. Again, we'll see if we get there or not, but that's what the market's pricing in. Volatility hasn't changed very much. Bitcoin vol went from 50 to 52% here week over week. ETH vol has been very sticky right there in those low 60s. I think it was 63% when we looked at this last week. And Solana realized vol still hanging around 90%. That's been the bigger mover, back up north of 150 now.
Why do you think the volatility hasn't expanded all that much? Because I feel like a 10% move-ish, what we have right now, usually see vol start to really increase. Like, is it usually, 2 or 3 days after, or is it, is this atypical of what we typically see with these big moves?
I don't think you've actually seen a big enough move yet relative to what Bitcoin can do, or at least what we've seen it do historically, that then brings buyers into the market when you look at the upside call options and you look at that tail. I think that's where you really have to see the speculation around your 80,000, 90,000, 100,000 strike off of those big moves. And so we've been chopping, certainly off of, a pretty decent pullback, close to 20%, as we talked about on a monthly basis last week. But you haven't necessarily seen anything in the market that's brought, rampant speculation to the upside end. I think when you look at ETH, why has it been sticky at right around 60%? We haven't seen volatility come down where it has collapsed at times in Bitcoin. And that's because I think there's still positions in front of this ETH ETF approval, which could potentially happen as early as the end of this week. We'll see.
Really?
That's something that, last week wasn't really part of the narrative, and now all of a sudden prices are back up. Oh, when's the ETF coming? Well, it's always been coming soon. I think that's why you've seen, those vols kind of sticky, just like you would ahead of an earnings announcement. Not that it's much of a, a binary announcement. We know that this is coming, but I think that's why you've seen those positions stay there. And this is something, again, where we've seen downside volatility. We haven't seen explosive upside volatility. And oftentimes in Bitcoin, we see that real positive relationship or correlation between price and vol. When price goes up, vol goes up, versus, say, the S&P, where we know there's an inverse correlation between price action and implied volatility. The one thing I do want to point out, as we've started to track just moving averages and use them as a bit of a momentum indicator, we had all the sell signals and kind of bearish momentum across Bitcoin, ETH, and Solana. With this move and those crossovers, takes you back into a little bit more neutral territory. Certainly isn't rip-roaring bullish yet. We'll see if it gets there or not. Obviously, you're still down on the month when you look at Bitcoin and ETH, but back into more neutral territory there. Don't have those sell signals. If they do materialize, I promise I will let you know, because you do not want to be on really the wrong side of any of these sustained trends in crypto, as they can be pretty strong. And you're also seeing that while Bitcoin market cap dominance is still hanging around 55%, in terms of price action on a relative basis, just the move off of those lows in the higher vol stuff like Solana, like ETH, the little bit of outperformance in those at this point in time. If you recall, Solana got down south of 130, back up above 150. ETH was 2,800, I think, off the lows, close to it. So nice little response there.
You think the ETH ETF is buy the rumor, sell the news type event? Like it kind of was for the Bitcoin ETFs. Like there was definitely some strength into it, and then it was a little bit of a pullback and kind of some chop for a couple weeks. After that sort of event, is that sort of thing, you're thinking for the ETH ETF? Do you think it pulls some liquidity away from spot, products or anything like that? Or
I don't necessarily think it's going to pull liquidity or potential inflows away from Bitcoin. That said, I don't think that at this point we're going to see as much excitement around it. It's something that I believe has been priced into the market for some time. We got the initial, really complete 180 out of the SEC. That caused the price to just absolutely rip. We retraced that entire move, even went lower underneath 3,000 last week. And so I think the market is starting to price this in again, obviously coming soon. You've seen a little bit of a positive reaction here in markets, but I don't think the flows are necessarily going to be as large as what we've seen go into Bitcoin, maybe over time. I still think it's very, very early when you look at flows around the Bitcoin ETF. But at the end of the day, a lot of it is going to hinge on what is the size of those flows. That's where you could get upside surprise. I think the expectation, if you look at the Grayscale Ethereum Trust versus the size of the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust ahead of the ETF announcement, is a barometer. It's much smaller, but you can extrapolate what that size might look like as a result. And so I think you're going to see flows, but it's going to take time. Bitcoin, for I think I wouldn't say the average person, but just for the RIA, for somebody that's not necessarily deep in the weeds, it's an easy narrative to understand, right? It's kind of digital gold. We get that. If you spend a lot of time on Ethereum, you figure it out, and it becomes very clear, I think, if you do the work around it. That said, what's the story around Ethereum? How is this exactly packaged up and explained to people? And that's what we're going to have to see, a little bit of work there in order to get investors to understand what this really is. I've heard a really interesting comparison by an investment advisor, the hedge fund manager, talking about it as an app store, because in a way it is an app store, but it needs a narrative. So we'll see. It's going to take some time, but I do believe that you're going to see decent inflows into it. It's in all of these ETF providers' best interest to sell this. Obviously, they want to generate fees off of it, and so there's going to be that support. But I think it's going to take time. So a very long-winded way. I think, there's definitely a potential for kind of buy the rumor, sell the news. We saw about a 20% pullback after the Bitcoin ETF announcement and launch. But then once we quickly saw that there were some, let's call them big-ass flows into those products to start with, it was pretty supportive of the price action. That said, if we just jump to the next slide really quickly, we could look at what those flows signaled and what the size of them were versus kind of how that's tapered off really since the spring. And here, if you go all the way to the right-hand side there of that slide, you can see the blue is the inflow there, the pink is the outflows. So obviously going to offset in terms of your net inflow. But I think we've had over the last week or so, not just into the ETFs, but other investment products as well. There's been about 1.4 billion of net inflow. Certainly has helped to offset some of that selling pressure we talked about, but it really is nowhere where it was relative to what we saw post the initial launch. So we'll see if this picks up, but it's definitely been helpful in terms of what's driving prices here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've also heard something similar, like Bitcoin's your hardware and ETH could be your software application type thing. But speaking to implied volatility and the moves we're seeing today, not necessarily seeing a huge increase in IV in Bitcoin itself or Bitcoin futures, but some of those high gamma products that we talk about all the time, MicroStrategy, Mara coin, you're seeing a 7.7% increase over the last 5 days in MicroStrategy, 5% in Mara, 2.7% in coin. So you're kind of seeing that implication that if this continues, maybe you'll get that big fall pop.
I think you will. I think a lot of it is going to depend on kind of what the liquidity profile looks like in markets. The same thing that's driving traditional assets as well. The same thing that's driving gold prices to near all-time highs right now. And I think, a big driver of that and part of that story is the dollar. So if we just jump to the next slide, got a couple just correlation metrics here. Just as looking at a 90-day rolling correlation, the top, if you could see it up, it's kind of small in the chart, apologies, but Bitcoin versus UUP. This is a bullish dollar index ETF. I think people are familiar with. So a good proxy for the dollar index. Obviously, that's heavily weighted towards the euro. But here's Bitcoin against the dollar. Here's ETH against the dollar. Excuse me. And you can see right now, negative spot 2.8, negative spot 2.66. So fairly strong inverse correlation. And we've seen a bit of dollar weakness here over the last couple of weeks. Also helping to support not just Bitcoin or crypto as an asset class, but helping to support other assets as well. I think when you look at that inverse correlation, so it's kind of the same thing again, and I think Bitcoin is playing catch up. That said, on the political front, you have seen a continuation of the shift post debate with the market kind of repricing the odds around Trump versus Biden here. And Trump, not to say that Biden wouldn't be or isn't, I know we haven't necessarily had pro-crypto policy here in the United States, but the impression is that if Trump were to become president a second time, he would have a different view on crypto this time around. He was, I believe, somewhat anti-crypto initially, if you go back to some of his comments, but he seems to have emerged as the pro-crypto candidate. And so if we just look at Polymarket odds, and you have 258 million that's into this market.
Shocking.
So
that's a shocking
Polymarket's
number.
Huge, right?
That's a lot.
Yeah.
I would not have thought that would be the marks here. That is a lot.
Yeah. This has emerged as really the preeminent kind of betting marketplace. Obviously, have predicted that you can go to, but just given that this is global, it's decentralized, it's accessible to anybody outside of the United States. Yeah. What is that market telling you for what it's worth? You've seen a pretty significant rise in odds and a repricing here around Donald Trump, 72% versus Joe Biden, and you can see the rest of the potential, who knows? I mean, it's obviously Trump versus Biden, but you can see the other names that are up there in this market. And so I think that has been somewhat supportive of the rise. I wouldn't say there's a direct connection between what happened over the weekend, but right, you're seeing a response in the market, whether it's donations to Trump, it's the DJT stock, or it's some of the meme coins, the political meme coins that exist out there, and you're certainly seeing crypto prices rally. But again, I think that when you look at Bitcoin, you look at ETH, playing catch up, the German selling pressure has been removed, and you're seeing inflows. So it's tough to just point to one thing, but this is definitely part of that recent narrative.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting when you have, especially when you consider the switch from the last term where he was anti-crypto, kind of not about it, more about really the equity market responded well when he won after the crazy volatility of the actual election. We'll see if that happens again this time, but I think all these things combined and the general market being strong today, not too surprised to see that move, which is, I think, another reason why you're not seeing too much of an increase in volatility in the Bitcoin futures. This volatility today is certainly a big move, but still not crazy. Like the 11-day expected move is $5,500. We're up 56 today. So.
And I think the final thing I'll point to, guys, in terms of just what's behind the move, what's driving markets here, this to me is always going to be the most important driver. Doesn't always get as much focus as kind of those quick headlines that you see in the news. But one component of, let's say, global liquidity or liquidity conditions, being the interest rate factor, being policy out of the Federal Reserve. I think when you look at the PBOC, People's Bank of China, credit impulses there, and that's just what happens globally from a kind of larger liquidity perspective. This is what's going to drive asset prices on the margin. And so what have we seen as of recently? A pretty significant repricing or increase in the likelihood that you're going to get a cut out of the Federal Reserve here in September. There's also been a jump in the odds for the July meeting. I think, you go from 6 to 12%. It's still only 12%. But right now we're looking at close to a 90% probability that you get a cut in September. And, again, another cut now here in November. So we'll see. And I don't think it matters as much whether that's 25 basis points, it's 50 basis points, or what the size of that cut is. It's the fact that you are now starting a rate cut cycle, and that over time should generally be supportive, maybe not necessarily just on its own, but arguably is pretty supportive of asset prices. When you see those cycles kind of show up in the markets. Yeah. So that's the other thing I think is probably really behind most of this and some of the dollar weakness you might be seeing.
Beautiful. I think we have that on the next slide, right? There you go.
There's those probabilities. And this is just for anybody that wants to look at this. I know you guys know where this is from, but this is the CME FedWatch tool. You can just Google it. It's a great tool.
We put this in the cherry picks as well, or a variation of this. We just kind of showed the change in rates exactly here over the last couple of years of just like the projections and the curve there. So if you got last week's cherry picks, it'll be on there as well. You can see the change in the curves.
Love the more.
More.
Yeah. More. I love it. But yeah, even like you said, an increase from 6 to 12%, still only 12%, but still it's double what it was. Yeah. So